5. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ed Olowokere. I am the Global Director for Governance here at the World Bank. Today, we are gathered together to launch a new book, Innovations in Tax Compliance, Building Trust, Navigating Politics, and Tailoring Reform. I wish we could be conducting this launch in person. That we are still living in a COVID-19 pandemic world 2 years on made a virtual event inevitable. While some countries have started to open up and resume some semblance of normalcy, the shadow of the pandemic is still clearly visible. Our best estimates suggest that the pandemic robbed the world of 5 years' worth of progress in reducing poverty. Our World Development Report, which was released earlier this week, shows that developing countries face growing risks from financial fragility created by the COVID-19 crisis and non-transparent debts. Question is, what does this mean for sustainable development in the long run? Governments have already had to respond to the crisis by raising public spending. But the double threat of increased poverty and the looming challenges of climate change mean that fiscal expansion will need to continue. And the expansion will require more revenues. But raising revenue in today's time is no easy feat at all. While the dual efforts of effective tax policy and tax administration are essential to closing these tax gaps, part of the problem is that citizens also need to be convinced that it is worth their while paying taxes. Building citizens' trust in institutions is therefore essential. This is a significant challenge, as in some countries, trust in governments and their legitimacy to collect taxes is eroding. For example, across 15 countries covered in one Afrobarometer survey, respondents' support for the government's right to collect taxes fell by 9 percentage points over the past decade. And as of the last round of the survey, fewer than half of taxpayers in African countries trust their tax administration. Building trust also helps mobilize political support for tax reform, prompting initially skeptical citizens to demand the changes to the tax system needed to ensure that everyone pays their fair share. Unless more can be done to improve people's trust in governments and their tax authorities and build a foundation of public support for more effective taxation and voluntary compliance so that people pay taxes without being forced to, tax collection will continue to suffer. The book we are launching today is aimed at tackling that problem. The publication is an output of the Innovations in Tax Compliance Program, ITC, a joint initiative of the Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment, or MTI in short, and Global Governance Practices at the World Bank. The team has been working to better understand the role that trust plays and how investments in trust can be coupled with realistic improvements in both tax policy and tax administration, and to build support for taxation to address areas of chronically weak tax compliance. Initiated in 2018, this program developed a conceptual framework, designed an operational toolkit, and engaged in 7-country pilots to test certain assumptions and provide valuable insights to World Bank operations. The work from the last 4 years is culminated in the publication we are discussing today. Congratulations to the team for their dedication and commitment to this important, innovative topic. Also, many thanks to the Global Tax Program and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for providing the necessary resources and support. I'm now going to turn to Chiara Bronchi, Practice Manager for the Fiscal Policy and Sustainable Growth Unit in MTI, who is going to be moderating the discussion today. I want to thank you all again for attending what will be an exciting event. Over to you, Chiara.
Good morning, Ed, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. This is going to be a very important launch for us. And let me just mention something that appeared on the Washington Post, but it's actually an article, a research that was supported by the Melinda Foundations, by Bloomberg Philanthropies, where they have analyzed a study of, they have analyzed pandemic preparedness across 177 countries and territories. And it appears that the report found that a key element in the success of delivering support or addressing the pandemic crisis was trust between institutions and citizens. So I want to say that this issue of trust and building trust has never been so important as today as a parameter for also supporting the recovery and moving out of this crisis. And with this, Ed has already introduced me graciously. Thank you very much. So let me just go over the program of today. I will be your moderator. We will have Marcelo Estevao, Global Director in the Macroeconomic Trade and Investment Global Practice of the World Bank, and Kalpana Kochhar, Director, Development Policy and Finance of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, who will give introductory remarks and overall picture of this program. And then following the introduction, we will pass over to the two of the authors, Anna Casters, an economist in the South Asia Department of the World Bank, and Will Pritchard, associate professors at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and he's the CEO of the International Center for Tax and Development. We want to keep the presentation within the time because we really want to have also to give time to two representatives of two tax authorities who have embraced the Innovation in Tax Compliance Approach program, and namely in Albania and in Kenya. So we will hear their experience we will hear the experience actually of Irena Xafa in Albania and Grace Wandera, Deputy Commissioner for Marketing and Communication in the Kenya Revenue Authority, and then we want to have a discussion. So with this, without further ado, I want to give the floor to Marcelo Estevao, and then we will pass it over to Kalpana. Marcelo, floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Chiara. Good morning, everyone. It is great to be here with all of you. Let me start by seizing on a point Ed just made about the need for more revenue. It is hard to overemphasize how important this has become now, particularly following the battering that COVID gave to tax revenues around the world. Even in the best of times, many emerging markets and developing economies struggle to maintain tax to GDP ratios high enough to cover the basic needs. But following the pandemic, things got much worse. Our estimates are that revenues dropped by 12% in real terms in 2020. And much of that decline, it's true that it will be reversed cyclically as economies get out of the rut caused by COVID-19, but still, the fiscal situation in developing countries is quite serious. At the same time the countries faced this revenue challenge, debt levels were already rising in many developing countries before COVID-19 hit. The fiscal expansion to fight the crisis generated a significant worsening of that burden. So trend was bad, then you were hit by the crisis. As highlighted in the World Development Report that was released earlier this week, 44 emerging economies saw their credit ratings deteriorate in 2020. As we continue to grapple with the crisis-driven higher rates of poverty, an ongoing pandemic, and a balloon in that problem, climate change looms on the horizon. So, as a result, developing countries are facing a triple threat: a great need for fiscal space to support the recovery and to grapple with the oncoming climate crisis, but at the same time, both reduced revenue and a worsening debt situation. Countries are thus seeking ways to raise the tax to GDP ratios, but at the same time, it is important that new revenue be raised in a more equitable fashion and in the least distortive way so that more tax revenues do not hurt economic growth. This is part of the World Bank strategy for green, resilient, and inclusive development, with an emphasis on the inclusive part for this particular session. And that's pretty much one of the core agendas for the macroeconomics group at the World Bank. This is important not only for the reasons I have just mentioned, but because more progressive taxation of income and wealth might itself bolster people's trust in the system, as equity is an important component of tax morale, and that's the key is the key point of the book we are discussing here. Substantial evidence across countries and regions indicates that the willingness to pay taxes and support for reform is higher when trust in the state is strong. In the long term, trust will lead to more sustainable, more sustained tax compliance and stronger institutions. These are the kinds of concerns that, again, are the core of what we do, and they are the core of the innovations in tax compliance program, which has been in operation for 4 years now. Before the program started, the bank was already doing excellent technical work on tax policy administration, but much of the focus of that work was on helping tax authorities improve their level of enforcement or finding ways to facilitate tax payments. Enforcement, so the reason people pay tax when they otherwise wouldn't, and facilitation, meaning making it easier for people to pay taxes, are important drivers of compliance, but they aren't the whole picture. As Ed noted, actually, what ITC does differently is that it takes trust more seriously. It makes clear that the way governments go about collecting taxes is integral to their relationship with their citizens, since the progress of paying taxes is a major point of interaction between the two. One can say that one of the most patriotic things a citizen can do is pay their due taxes. Even in the best of times, many emerging markets and developing economies struggle to maintain tax to GDP ratios high enough to cover their basic needs. On top of this, the pandemic has heralded a decline in revenues, like I said before, especially in low-income countries, and that will take a few years to recover to pre-COVID-19 levels. And citizens' perceptions of important determinants of trust, like fairness, equity, and accountability, will ultimately influence their willingness to participate in the tax system, making these important drivers of compliance. Over the past 4 years, the ITC program has developed a holistic approach to tax diagnostics, which combines the insights from the enforcement, facilitation, trust framework, a keen eye toward the political challenges policymakers face, as well as a data-driven approach which relies on surveys of taxpayers' views, providing tax authorities with new insights on their taxpayers. The program has fielded this approach to diagnosing compliance issues in the form of 7 country pilots, spanning several countries in Africa, South Asia, and Europe and Central Asia, both to unpack the relationships between trust and compliance in multiple contexts, but also to understand how trust and tax morale can be enhanced and operationalized. In addition to diagnosing the main binding constraints that tax authorities face in improving compliance, results of the pilots have also fed into several World Bank operations, often in the form of tax-related disbursement-linked indicators, or as baseline indicators. Ultimately, the truest test of the approach and the most important challenge is to put ITC's ideas into practice in real-world reform programs. And the macro group does exactly this bridge between knowledge and actual application in our World Bank programs. Anyway, today we are going to hear more about the ITC approach from those that developed the framework, as well as hear more about experiences the pilot countries have had fielding this approach. Before we begin, I want to turn to Kalpana Kochar from the Gates Foundation, a very generous supporter of the program, for a few thoughts. So thank you very much. This is quite important work, and I'm looking forward to helping, operationalize this whole framework. Thanks. Now to the Gates Foundation, if they are here.
Kalpana, can you connect? Maybe Kalpana has some
Chiara, I think she's having some technical difficulties. I've been able to speak and unmute, but I can deliver her remarks in her place. It's Peterhurst here from the Gates Foundation.
Welcome, Peter. Thank you so much. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Marcelo, and the rest of the panel. The Gates Foundation funds the Innovation and Tax Compliance Project because we're excited by its goal of introducing new and innovative approaches to the traditional work of tax capacity builders. We also value how the project has fostered collaboration across the tax and development community, partnering World Bank tax specialists with experts at fellow Gates grantee, the International Center for Tax and Development, and also working directly with ministries of finance and revenue authorities across the World Bank's country network. So it gives me great pleasure to be here today to celebrate the launch of this superb publication. I'm excited to see the impact of the program as it powers towards implementation. So Ed and Marcelo have already talked a bit about the need for tax revenue following the devastating impact of COVID-19 pandemic for countries to fund recoveries and to finance public services. So this is undoubtedly the case. Governments obviously need income, and tax offers the most sustainable form of finance available. Although the quality of revenue raised is important, I want to emphasize that so is the quality and the equity of that revenue, especially if governments want to foster a sustaining social contract with citizens. Tax reform has traditionally focused heavily on strengthening enforcement to make taxpayers pay and facilitating compliance to make it easier to pay. But as this book that we're launching today demonstrates, improving the trustworthiness of tax systems is equally as important. Not only will trust boost revenues through increased voluntary compliance, but public trust in the tax system can help to mobilize political support for tax reform, leading initially skeptical citizens to expect changes to the tax system that ensures that everyone pays their fair share. So it's my hope that this framework will become an essential reference point for tax policymakers, for tax administrators and practitioners, that it will lead to a shift in the paradigm from taxing more to taxing better. That will undoubtedly happen as it gets picked up and used across the World Bank country network, building on the already successful pilots, but it should not stop there. Through actions such as the Addis Tax Initiative, partner countries and donors have shown they're committed to increasing tax reform efforts. As they take forward their plans, they too can get real benefit by designing their tax programs around the ITC framework. Because it is not only through widespread adoption that building trust in tax systems will because it's only through widespread adoption that building trust in tax systems will become an established part of the tax administrator's toolkit. Thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Chiara. I do see Kalpana is now on the screen though. Chiara?
All right. Can someone unmute Chiara, please? She's having difficulty.
Carlos, can you unmute her?
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
Sorry,
we can.
I have a glitch. I need somebody to control my voice, my connections, because I don't have the control anymore of muting or unmuting. Sorry about that, but I see Kalpana.
Go ahead.
She's connected. So Kalpana, I just want to give you an opportunity to say a few words if you wish. You're welcome, and sorry for this glitch.
No, I think Peter said everything that we wanted to say. We're very excited about this. And I, too, I'm very sorry that I've been trying to get on for like 15 minutes. But anyway, here we are. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalpana. And let me then pass over the floor to Anna Castor. But before we start, just a reminder to everybody, it's quite a few of us connected. Those who don't speak, please keep your video off. It improved the bandwidth and also the microphone. And Anna, the floor is over to you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. And a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's really wonderful to be with you here today to launch our publication. In what follows, I will discuss, also on behalf of our co-authors, the key contributions of our work, after which Will Pritchard will discuss how this leads us into new directions of reform strategies. While we're putting up the slides, I will start describing some of the key contributions of our book, which start on the next slide. Thank you. Great. So the key contribution of this book is not so much to seek silver bullets or grant new insights. It is actually instead to take stock of knowledge, which are fragmented strands of research and practical insights, to reflect on what it concretely tells us about how reform might be pursued differently, and then to develop some concrete tools to make that translation of research insight into practice or reality. In that sense, the work reflects the belief that research has much to teach us, but that reform programs often fail to put that research insight effectively into practice. The publication thus reflects the value of trying to pull what we know together into a coherent framework, of illustrating the ways in which that framework may push reform strategies into new directions, and of developing tools to incorporate those insights more systematically into reform programs. That is the objective that the work sets out to do. To do so, the book draws on the best illustrations of innovative approaches to tax reform from both experience and research, and seeks to extract key lessons. At the center of this framework is the development of an analytical approach to design reform interventions that have 5 characteristics. To start with, interventions are technically robust. This is central to all work that we do at the World Bank. And they look for interventions that are rooted in an understanding of the specific challenges holding back improved tax compliance in specific locations. But in addition to this, the framework adds 4 elements that are sometimes implicitly considered, but by making them explicit become structural components of any design of reform. Through this, the framework ensures first that it makes explicit the political constraints and concrete strategies for navigating them. Secondly, the framework prioritizes trust building, as we have already heard a lot earlier this morning, by expanding fairness, equity, responsiveness, and accountability of the tax system in order to improve compliance of taxpayers and to build political support for taxation reform. and I'll come back to that in a second. Thirdly, it seeks to look for interventions that strengthen the social contract by supporting reform strategies that enable citizen engagement. It does include the taxpayer's perspective in the reform dialogue. And fourth, it targets reforms that focus at overcoming key binding constraints in specific contexts. So if there is a set of reforms that are viable, which ones are the ones that are most binding at that point in time and are likely to move the reform progress forward? Ultimately, this amounts in many ways to an emphasis on taxing better, as we've also heard earlier this morning, not just taxing more, to ultimately improve public outcomes and reform sustainability. What this leads us to on the next slide is our core conceptual framework underpinning the work, where core components are trust, the fiscal contract, and public support. Now, moving from the left to the right, we start with political support for reform. This is always needed to initiate reform, with the need to select initial reform targets that are politically feasible and supported by a clear strategy for navigating political constraints. Without that support, a reform program never kicks off. Where there are reform openings, the framework then urges reformers to consider the traditional investments in enforcement and facilitation that tax administrations are very familiar with, but to equally focus on strategies to build public trust. The payoff to a greater focus on trust can be seen towards the far right of the image, because by focusing on trust building, two goals are emphasized. It will not only strengthen enforced compliance, as you can see, but it also aims to improve quasi-voluntary compliance, or what we otherwise refer to as improving tax morale. It will also strengthen the fiscal contract by improving the link between tax collection, popular engagement, and improved service delivery. And then importantly, what all of this does, by emphasizing trust building, reform is then more likely to drive the development of sustainable political support for reform, thus iteratively opening new reform possibilities. This is illustrated by the arrows that then circle back to political support for reform. It just creates a virtuous cycle. While in some cases, large-scale reforms may be immediately possible and desirable, this model actually points us towards the potential for strategies for achieving incremental gains through targeted reform interventions that then gradually open up and strengthen the reforms, the political support for reform. Now, what the book does is that it lays out this framework, and then next it applies it to different tax segments and tax types. For example, high net worth individuals, small and medium enterprises, direct taxation, corporate taxation. And it does so because the interplay between these different elements that we see here in the framework and the specific compliance challenges that tax administrations face for different segments of taxpayers, they differ depending on which group we're talking about. And so the book itself develops in the subsequent chapters, applies this framework to all these different frameworks. And Will tell us a little bit more about that. Over to you, Will.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. And thanks everyone for being here with us. As Anna said, these are entirely new ideas. Research and practitioners have long acknowledged the importance in broad terms of politics, of trust building, and of strengthening fiscal contracts to making tax reform efforts more successful. Our key goal here is translating research and practical insights into concrete changes in diagnostic approaches and reform strategies. Because we know that while research and experience has highlighted these kinds of issues, they are often in practice pushed towards the sidelines of reform efforts in practice. When we talk about navigating political constraints, this has to be about specific strategies to identify commitment to reform in different places, to anticipate potential points of resistance to reform, and developing strategies to bypass, neutralize, or confront that political resistance when necessary. It's not enough simply to ask whether political will exists or not in particular places. We know that political support is always partial, complex, and changing over time. Political resistance may come from political leaders themselves, fearful of electoral costs, or who are protecting key allies. It may come from within tax administrations themselves, protecting existing fiefdoms or rent-seeking opportunities. It may come from among well-organized and powerful groups of taxpayers. Each of those requires distinct political strategies, and will likewise offer distinct opportunities for seeking to construct bases of support for reform. The book tries to highlight examples of these kinds of distinct political strategies and point our political analysis towards that kind of specificity. The book likewise tries to be specific about what we mean by trust building and focuses on the extent of public trust across 4 distinct elements: fairness, equity, responsiveness, and accountability in tax systems, operational targets for building trust among taxpayers. And that specificity is very important. A strategy to strengthen procedural fairness in tax administration is vastly different from a strategy to strengthen service delivery, and different again from strategies to address perceptions of uneven compliance or inequitable tax burdens. Different contexts will face different challenges, present different needs, and offer different reform opportunities. Taking trust building seriously in reform programs means having strategies to understand specific barriers to trust in specific places, and for pointing towards specific strategies for building specific kinds of trust among specific constituencies. Finally, when we talk about fiscal contracts, we understand that this building stronger fiscal contracts, previous slide, thanks. Strengthening fiscal contracts depends on tax reform strategies that explicitly seek to promote citizen engagement and generate pressures for reciprocity. In some ways, it's become routine to refer to the potential for expanded taxation to drive taxpayer mobilization and what's often called tax bargaining toward the expansion of accountability. But that doesn't happen automatically. It depends critically on how reform is designed to support taxpayer engagement. That may mean seeking to expand transparency, outreach, and education about what taxpayers pay and why. It might mean making more explicit links between taxation and expenditures, through which engagement by taxpayers can happen. It may mean supporting formal spaces for engagement, from town halls to WhatsApp groups to radio call-in shows to participatory budgeting. The key insight here is that those things should be built into reform programs around revenue raising, and that those strategies can be good for taxpayers and for governments. Because for governments, these are the strategies that can lay the foundation for sustained political support for reform programs. Next slide, please. Of course, ultimately, the key question for us and for this book is, does the kind of analysis that we're describing actually lead to distinctive and more successful approaches to reform? Evidently, our belief is that it can. Following an open chapter that presents the conceptual framework, subsequent chapters of the book look at challenges of taxation across a variety of tax segments and domains, and seek to capture what recent research and experience tells us about how we might most usefully think about pressing tax challenges, while then presenting a wide range of examples and illustrations of potentially useful reform strategies. Let me provide some high-level illustrations of the ways in which I think the analysis in this book points us in somewhat different directions from where reform has tended to go historically, recognizing that these are very high-level generalizations and, of course, things we'd love to discuss more in the discussion. Starting from property taxes, traditionally, reform of property taxes has been dominated by new investments in technology and reliance on complex systems for identifying, registering, and valuing land. But research has been clear that the challenges of property taxation are primarily political, and that local governments have often faced sharp capacity constraints in implementing these models. As a result, these complex projects have frequently failed. This framework pushes analysts to seek models that match limited local capacities and which can build a better base of political support for reform. To do that, it highlights a growing number of cases that have focused on building simplified, transparent systems that increase procedural fairness and equity, while also introducing specific initiatives like participatory budgeting to build bases of public support for reform. Efforts to tax the rich are in many ways quite similar. Historically, political sensitivity has often led such efforts to be downplayed in reform programs, and where there has been a focus on strengthening taxation of the wealthy, it has often focused on building complex systems to support better data sharing, despite the fact that the barriers to reform, again, are primarily political when we talk about taxation of the best off. This volume suggests that new approaches are needed. Such taxation warrants greater focus because it's key not only to revenue raising, but also to building broader public trust in tax systems. In turn, reform strategies need to confront those political barriers to reform more explicitly. This framework highlights countries that have sought to diagnose specific barriers to effective taxation of the rich, and who have then built incremental strategies for strengthening existing processes, for building trust with wealthy taxpayers, and for fostering broader political support for those efforts across a broader base of taxpayers. A very different example comes from debates about taxing the informal sector, which has been a major focus among governments in recent years. Reform programs in this area have tended to focus heavily on formalization of informal firms through a combination of enforcement and facilitation efforts. Our framework here first asks whether this is the right priority, given research evidence that the benefits of formalization may be small for smaller firms particularly, and evidence that smaller firms frequently face heavier formal and informal burdens than is often believed. In turn, it highlights alternative approaches to taxing informal firms that are better targeted towards different segments of the informal sector, and which, for smaller firms in particular, focus more heavily on trust building and reciprocity in order to bring into the tax net those firms who are most likely to benefit from formalization. A final example comes from an effort in the book to highlight the value of approaches to taxing multinational firms and international wealth that is more firmly guided by local realities in lower income countries. The majority of international reform programs today ask, how can we build local capacity to implement international standards and rules? This framework doesn't reject that approach, but pushes readers to also flip that question around and in parallel ask, what technical and political constraints and other contextual specificities exist in lower income countries, and what strategies might and might not be effective in light of those constraints? There are a much wider range of topics illustrated in the book. I hope this gives a flavor of some of the ways in which we think this pushes analysis in new directions. But I'll stress again, these are not brand new insights. Instead, it's an effort to pull together the best research and practical experience in order to draw lessons and support more nuanced diagnostic and reform strategies. And of course, we'd love to discuss those illustrations in a bit more detail during the discussion. Back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Will. Next slide, please. So very briefly to finish our introduction, of course, it is one thing to put these ideas into a book, but the truest test of the approach and the most important challenge in the end, but also the most exciting opportunity, is to put these ideas into practice in real-world reform programs and to seeking to actively shift prevailing approaches while building broader capacity to engage in these kind of analysis that we have laid out. To do that, the book has been accompanied by developing an analytical toolkit that seeks to guide analysis of reform challenges towards these key elements, and to push for a deep understanding in particular of the details of local technical and political needs, constraints and opportunities. Most diagnostic assessment tools focus on the technical solutions and are modeled on the idea of good practices, which administrations assess based on their proximity to these ideas. Those tools have a valuable role to play, for sure, but they also face important limitations which guide the approach that we have developed here. The available tools typically place little emphasis on politics and trust building because they do not make these elements explicit and therefore offer limited insights into viable reform strategies. They also do often not provide a framework for deciding how to prioritize reform elements in light of what is most feasible, given time and resource constraints. Not everything can be done, but a lot is always needed to be done. They also tend toward common solutions across locations, guided by international experience, rather than maximizing space for local experimentation, tailored reform. There is certainly space for both of these. The Diagnostic Toolkit for this project has 4 elements incorporating some of these aspects explicitly. It starts with a technical assessment, which may piggyback on existing tools, and it often actually does. And this remains a necessary and important basis for any reform design. But it then also adds on a few other elements. It includes a problem-focused political economy analysis, for example, which aims at assessing specific sources of resistance and political allies, and specific strategies for building viable and sustainable reform options. This is then also coupled with a taxpayer trust survey designed to understand specific drivers of low trust, low tax compliance, and low support for reform, and to identify specific strategies to address these low levels. It is thus designed to make the focus on trust operationally relevant and specific by bringing in the taxpayer's voice themselves. And finally, what the operational toolkit does is it combines these three elements into a binding constraints analysis that focuses attention not only on where the gaps are, but also on which gaps are the most pressing at that point in time for the particular tax administration and country in question. Importantly, the structure of operational teams reflects this diversity in approach because they usually include, for example, a technical tax expert, a political economist, and a survey expert. If we then move on to the last slide. So what has happened in parallel to the conceptual work that we have laid out in more detail just this morning is that the Innovations in Tax Compliance program has conducted country pilots with tax administrations across different regions, where the team has piloted the operationalization of the framework of the conceptual thinking. 6 pilots have been completed thus far, looking at different tax segments and tax types, and they have all formulated localized reform strategies, and another 3 are actually at the moment ongoing, and additional pilots are being added as we go along. These pilots are linked to World Bank operational engagement. They feed into lending operations, and in addition, they also feed into standard World Bank analytical products such as country economic memorandums. We are now working together with the World Bank Enterprise Survey. So there's a wide variety into which these pilots feed into the core operational work of the World Bank. Very excitingly, and perhaps the most important session of today, we will now actually turn to 2 of our dear colleagues from 2 of the countries we worked with. Albania, where we completed a pilot last year, and also Kenya, where a pilot is currently ongoing. So with that, I hand it back to Chiara. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Will, for this overview of the rationale, the approach, and also the pilots. And now we really want to hear from Irena. And Irena, over to you. We have about 10 minutes each, so please go ahead.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am Irena Jaffa, the former Chief of Cabinet at the General Taxation Directorate in Albania, currently serving as advisor to the Minister of Finance and Economy of Albania. Let me start by congratulating to today's presentations to all of you, and I would also like to extend my gratefulness and also appreciation to the work that the team, the World Bank team, has done, specifically to Anna and to Roy for all the enormous work that they have been doing, and also on the very good collaboration that we had during this pilot project which took place in Albania. So I will try to go through a little bit of what are our thoughts, and also the things that we learned after this enormous job. We first encountered the innovation approach as of last year, when I was still working at the tax office, and we sought for the World Bank's advice on how to improve the tax compliance among individuals, and especially in individuals with a high net worth, or the healthy one in Albania. Albania relies heavily on indirect taxation, and the challenge ahead is to further improve direct taxation. Compared to our peers, our CIT performs relatively well, but we lag behind on personal income taxation revenue. Improving the PIT performance, and in particular taxation of the wealthy, is a complex issue, and I believe not only in Albania but also in other countries as well, but especially in countries like us, which still the fragility is still visible. Saying that, I mean that a lot has to be done in terms of the information, and also on the risk identification, and also on the program management. We time to time face obstacles when it comes to obtaining the multiple sources of data required, especially to map the compliance and risk to the key revenue items. We believe that we need to improve the IT applications to support the risk analysis and management reports and other compliance tools that will need to support in general the compliance efforts. The World Bank team carried out an assessment of the key drivers of tax compliance among the individuals in Albania, using the innovations in tax compliance methodology. They also set out to survey taxpayers, which helped us understand the range of a wide range of issues. One striking aspect that I would like to point out today was the level of survey respondents that admitted to not fully comply with their tax obligations. Using the survey experimental technique, 32% of the respondents admitted they did not fully comply. We of course know that there is a non-compliant. I mean, this is not this didn't came as quite as new to us, and actually this was also the reason for us to request the assessment in the first place. The survey showed us that most, but not all, taxpayers feared the enforcement audit threat that the tax office will use onto them. We also learned that most individual taxpayers find it difficult to comply with their tax obligation. This makes us think that we can do more to facilitate and that our taxpayer service strategy is central to this effort, and will hopefully help or encourage the compliance. The other aspect of the assessment also looked to the elements of trust, which were also clearly mentioned also on the previous presentations made by you, which we believe that it's a very, very important tool. And to take an example of that, through the survey, the stakeholder interviews, we learned that taxpayers perceive that there are inequalities in tax burdens. Some of these interview stakeholders express the concern that political influence also increases the level of wealth, and that the political connections facilitate the wealth accumulation. Indeed, these are very complex questions for the tax administration. And of course that the GDT, so the General Directorate of Tax, alone cannot solve this issue. This requires a whole of government approach and goodwill. But of course that the tax authority certainly plays a leading role through fair enforcement and tax collection, and we are working hard in improving or in improving our compliance strategy, in including all the necessary tools that we believe to be useful in accomplishing this this task. The assessment resulted in a report that was very useful for the General Director for Tax Administration, because it helped identifying and better understand the compliance changes related to this, specifically to this segment of taxpayers. And the survey also added value to the ongoing ongoing force and efforts by the GDT. Especially to the high wealth individual unit, which is recently, since 1 year actually, recently in the new, it's a new unit within the tax administration. The work produced concrete recommendations, such as the need to make more effective use of the third-party data, and also on the pre-filled tax returns, in order that to expand the issuance of guidance note and to use advanced ruling. By doing so, we believe that we will increase the transparency and thus also the trust in the tax system. Last but not least, the largest benefit of the tax innovation approach was the complementary of different elements, and it brought out an assessment that goes beyond the technical aspect, and hopefully to bring in the taxpayer's perspective as well as the political economy around taxation. The focus is just it's not just on the enforcement and the facilitation, but also on the role of the trust in the encouragement of the voluntary compliance. This emphasis on trust and navigating policies and also on the politic of reform is something that I encounter also in my new role as advisor to the Minister of Finance and Economy. We aim towards improving tax compliance, and the government is planning to amend the tax procedures code in order to increase the areas of exchange of information between the financial institutions and the tax administration, and is aiming to strengthen the tax administration legal power in auditing and identifying the potential risks. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you for your collaboration and support, and looking forward to the further discussion.
Thank you very much, Irena. Let me give the floor to Grace, and we will then come back in the discussion. Grace? Hello.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's logged in. Thank you very much for having us as the Kenya Revenue Authority to share our experience. I'd like to thank the ITC for considering us for this pilot program. We are just at the very beginning of this program, having had our first meeting in January. Probably I will just start off by painting the challenge that we have in Kenya. So based on Agenda 2063, there's a lot of focus on domestic revenue mobilization. When you look at the Kenya Vision 2030, our ambition is to become a middle-income economy by 2030, and therefore there is even greater need to look at how we raise funds through domestic revenue mobilization. In the 8th Corporate Plan for the Kenya Revenue Authority, our main theme is revenue mobilization through tax simplification, technology-driven compliance, and tax-based expansion. And probably this is where this discussion interfaces through the issue of tax-based expansion. We have 14 million registered taxpayers, of whom 7 million are active. And we have a VAT gap of about 48%. And when you look at our on-time filing, it's at 70%, and our on-time payment is at 77%. Just a little bit to show the compliance gap that is there. However, the bigger challenge is that we have a huge informal sector, which is estimated at about 6.8 million. With this large informal sector, the big question is where are they and how do we reach them? And then this points us back to the discussion we've had on the political context. So we have a national and a sub-national government, and most of the informal sector operates at the sub-national level. Our biggest challenge, therefore, is to look for strategies that will enable the revenue administration to be able to interact with the sub-national government without them feeling threatened or feeling that their powers to collect levies at a subnational level are being taken over by the national government. Of course, as an organization, we've had attempts of trying to do this through a policy framework where we introduced the presumptive tax, which was linked to licensing at the subnational level. And this tax did not perform well. It had very dismal performance. I think the big question for us is, yes, we want to expand the tax base. We want to bring in the informal sector. We do know where they are, but how do we do this? And I think that's where the ITC comes in terms of looking for innovative ways of going through or cutting through the clutter and being able to get a solution that is suitable for our context. In terms of the issue of facilitation, probably, I think as a revenue administration, we've worked hard at making it easy for the clients who are already compliant through areas such as self-service channels, online service provision, having a call center, having over 90 locations in Kenya so that then we are closer to the taxpayer, using social media and other communication channels. Our only probably reflection is, did we use a broad stroke approach that doesn't actually meet the needs of the informal sector? And we are hoping that we will be able to answer these questions working together with the ITC. The other issue that probably we are reflecting on is, are our communication and education programs inclusive? So traditionally, the tax authorities have segmented using the large taxpayers, middle or small size taxpayers. But would it be beneficial to borrow from other disciplines in terms of segmentation and look at knowing, especially the informal sector deeper in what we'd call know your customer, similar to what the banks do? And probably the other questions we are asking, is there credence in looking at models such as the sales funnel to augment the incubation process that we have currently in terms of recruiting and incubating customers? And this comes to mind because when we look at the local banking sector in Kenya, we have disruptive banks like the Equity Bank of Kenya that has been able to use these approaches to grow the people who are banked through the Equity Bank. Would that be an approach that we'll be thinking of when we think about our recruitment and incubation process? During the first session we had with the ITC, of course, we discussed our block management system, which we are using for recruitment. And the question I think the research will be looking at is the efficacy of this approach, and if there's a better way of doing it and a more sustainable way. So it's one thing to get people in the net, it's another for them to pay and to continue paying. So I think that will be one area that we'll be looking at. The discussions so far have looked at the issue of tax morale. And I think the biggest issue when we do our dipstick research or when we go out and look at our customer journey maps in terms of this sector is that this segment feels that they are apathetic generally towards the tax agenda because when we look at the principle of reciprocity, they do not have access to social amenities. They probably feel that there's little concern for this segment. And this might mean that even as we go through this discussion, there's credence in looking at the tax expenditure side of things, so that then probably the tax morale of this segment may rise and probably see some action in terms of payment of taxes. I think there's also the issue of I had talked about the political context, the need for collaboration, looking for strategies to collaborate with the county governments. But there is also the fact that Kenya has the M-Pesa phenomenon, and now we have fintechs that have moved into the space of banking the unbanked, and therefore they do have data that could be very crucial in terms of expanding the tax base. And probably one of the considerations would be how to partner with these fintechs, and how then are we able to get this data so that then we could use it for tax purposes. Other considerations we are having is things such as maturity model for the informal sector, and beyond recruiting, beyond incubation, how do we help this sector grow so that we can not only get them in the tax net, not only get them to pay, but also increase the quantum in terms of what they're paying. So I think I'll end at that and say that we are looking forward to this collaboration to be able to unlock the potential of the informal sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace and Irena, for a very interesting, for sharing a very interesting experience on the implementation of the ITC approach. Let's now open the floor for questions and comments. People are also, colleagues or participants, also welcome to post a question on the chat. We're keeping track of it. I also asked all the authors to be able to respond and to participate in the discussion. So I'm very pleased to also have Hodam as attending today, and Steve Davenport, and of course Anna and Will, who have just given the presentation. I don't see questions on the chat, but perhaps I can kick off by asking, and then you guys decide, the authors decide who's going to answer. I think it was a very clear presentation, and also very interesting to hear the experience of Albania and Kenya on how they see this approach and the importance of improving tax morale for tax compliance, and also leading to more revenue mobilization in a fair manner. But I want to go back to the presentation. I thought there were a few points focusing on distinctive strategies for property taxation. And as you know, property taxation it's considered an important tax source, but very difficult to implement. And I think in the presentation it was mentioned that this idea that countries should consider simpler and more transparent systems, in part because they can help to overcome the political resistance of introducing or reforming property taxations. So I was wondering if also one of you could say more about the help of technical design and systems, and how we should change them. As you know, the bank is certainly committed to support tax reforms, and also we have been supporting property taxation reforms. So it would be interesting to know from your perspective and from what you've learned, what we should do differently or we could do better.
Anna, I think probably I should take that one. And does that sound right? Great. So thanks, Chiara, for the very interesting question. I'll try to keep the response relatively contained here. But I think you've touched on one of the things that I think is a really important message of this overall sort of framework and approach, which is that when we think about the technical design of reform interventions, we want to think also about the way in which that technical design relates to the political feasibility of reform. And so taking your example of property taxation, and to say a bit more than I did in the first presentation, I think historically what we've seen in a lot of, not just reform programs, but in the way that these systems tend to operate in low and middle income countries, is you have systems of administration that are relatively complex. So often they're underpinned by sending expert valuers to go to sort of every single property in a jurisdiction, to identify that property, to measure it, to attach a value to it, and potentially also to register ownership of that property. In theory, there's nothing wrong with that approach. The challenge is that it's very complex. It's also potentially very subjective and very hard for taxpayers to understand. When you send an expert valuer out to value a property, they assign a value. The taxpayer doesn't necessarily know where that's come from. They see obvious opportunities for sort of collusion or other sort of informality around how those values are set. And likewise, when we think about property registration and so on, similar kinds of dynamics can arise. So one of the questions we've thought about in thinking about reform design is how can you design that system of property identification and valuation in a way that's simple and transparent for taxpayers to understand? Because if we can help taxpayers to understand, to feel confident that their property has been identified appropriately, to understand how it's been valued, to appeal if they think it's been valued incorrectly, they're going to feel much more confident in the procedural fairness of that system and much more confident that there's equity in the distribution of tax burdens across different citizens. And our bet has been if taxpayers feel that there is that fairness and equity built into the system in the way that it's designed technically, you're going to find much stronger political support for reform and in turn, higher levels of compliance. I think concretely, I'd give one example. We've been working for a number of years on a reform program in Freetown in Sierra Leone, where we tried to do just this. We introduced a new process for identifying and valuing properties, which we've tended to call a points-based valuation. But at root, that system says, let us identify each property from satellite images. Let's then record a key set of characteristics about those property, which are easy to observe and objective, and then use those characteristics to design a valuation model. The key message here is then when we send bills to taxpayers, they can see transparently a picture of their property, they can see all the valuation criteria, they can see how their property has been valued, and they can see what underpins that valuation, and they can appeal if they have concerns. Our experience in Freetown has been that it's taken property taxes, which historically are hugely unpopular, and actually made that reform quite popular among taxpayers themselves, who have shown strong support for that program, who seem to have really embraced that transparency about the system and the sense that they can understand how it works. In turn, not surprisingly, there have been some forms of political resistance of various kinds to reform from other sources. And one of the advantages of that simplified, highly transparent system is it's been easy to explain and justify in trying to navigate those political hurdles and political challenges. And so I think you'll see across a lot of the work in this book, we see that we come back to this idea of simplifying systems, making them more transparent. Partially that's because they become more administrable, but again, partially it's because it can help to mobilize political support for reform. Okay, let me stop there and see if others want to add anything, or we'll open up to more questions.
Okay, thank you, Will. It looks like we can maybe move to another question. I see that there are also questions on the chat, so I'd like to give an opportunity to the participants to ask to have their questions addressed. But I need to ask the people asking questions to put the question complete. I see one that is half. It's not complete, so it's hard to understand what is the question. But I see that Roland is asking. We would like to hear more from, I guess, Grace and also the team, both Grace and Irena. So from their perspective, if there was any reluctance or apprehension about applying the analytical framework, and also how the bank was able basically to dialogue with the governments and to alleviate any concern or hesitancy that they had in applying this framework. I don't know if Irena or Grace want to take up this question, and maybe another team member, also, I mean, a co-author. Grace, would you like to start from there? Was there any apprehension from the government of Kenya?
Thank you. Well, there's no apprehension because we are looking for support in terms of growing our tax base. And if we can have a technical analysis that could help us unlock that, well, it's very welcome. But I think also the approach that was used by the team was good because we had the buy-in from the National Treasury. Before then, we were brought in as the revenue administration. So I think the process was also fantastic. Thank you.
Irena?
Yeah, I can say the same for Albania, actually. The government and the tax administration are both working at the same direction. Actually, the designing of the unit, the special unit, which I already mentioned, for which is investigating on the high wealth individual, comes as a recommendation from the international organizations, and we've had the support of the IMF and the World Bank, and we will continue to ask for their support in designing the best practices and models in order then we can intensify our research and improve our methods of auditing. Thank you.
Thank you. So it sounds
I mean,
like
if that
yeah,
was the question, if I correctly understood, if not, then.
Yeah, I think the idea was, you know, a lot of this is a less technical approach in the traditional sense, is looking at all the agents in how, you know, how to make tax compliance work, and it's not just a technical solution. It was really to understand the underlying issues that sometimes are not only technical. But it sounds like that in a way both Albania and Kenya were fairly ready or open to this idea of building trust and creating a fairer and easier to access environment for tax compliance. But perhaps, I don't know if Ro or Anna or Steve or others want to add.
Maybe I can jump in here, Chiara, if you don't mind. I think in our experience in trying to work with governments, we've noticed that a lot of tax administrations are usually very interested in finding out what taxpayers are actually thinking and in the perceptions that taxpayers have of the system. And in that sense, the approach that we offer in this work, which combines the technical analysis with these survey instruments, which allow administrations to gauge these taxpayer perceptions, has been something that in my experience, at least, a lot of tax administrations have found useful and have been very interested in deploying in their particular countries.
Thank you, Ro. Sorry, I'm not sure. Forgive me, I'm not showing my face because I have also problems with the bandwidth. But I'm here, and I see that we have other questions, but maybe one just to continue on this, and then I move on other issues. It's I think Matt is also saying how much are levels of trust determined by the interaction directly with the tax authority, and much of the trust is being driven by larger external forces. I think Will, you said at some point about political views, communications, expressing values, opening up the issue basically.
Great. Yeah, let me pick that one up just a little bit then. It's a very question, and in some ways it would be nice to know much more than we currently do about how trust in tax systems and then attitudes towards tax compliance as a result evolve over time. I think we have quite a lot of indicators that sort of show us what this looks like at a moment in time, not as much that tracks this over time. I think that said, you know, my general sense of the research is that we do have some pretty decent evidence that suggests that people's trust in tax systems and broader tax morale is shaped to an important degree by their perceptions of the fairness, equity, responsiveness, accountability of tax systems. I don't think in general we should expect that those things will change overnight, right? I think those things are sort of sticky attitudes, so they will change over time. But I do think we see that evidence, and that comes from a few places. You know, I think we see within countries that those who have sort of more positive views of the fairness, equity, accountability of tax systems tend to have higher tax morale. I think there's also some historical research recently that has tended to suggest that where we see big differences in tax morale across countries, while we often think of that as being cultural, actually it seems to be more deeply related to actual perceptions of government and how effective it is. And in some ways that then becomes normalized, those attitudes, but they're rooted in experiences of the tax administration, and of course of how revenues are spent after they're raised. And I guess that's the last thing I'd say about this. When we think about how how we build trust in the tax system, among the things we highlight in our framework, some of these things are things that tax administrations control directly, right? Tax administrations can shape the extent of procedural fairness in the way taxes are administered. Again, our sense is that research increasingly is pointing towards those being very important for how people perceive the tax system, perceive tax reform, and think about tax compliance. But then there are other elements of this around how tax revenues are spent, which are harder for tax administrations to shape directly. As Irena had mentioned, that sort of it requires a whole of government approach to reform. But even there, I think part of the logic of this framework is if we think that taxpayers' attitudes towards reform are shaped by the quality of service delivery, let's design reform programs in a way that supports public engagement with government and therefore makes the likelihood of effective service delivery stronger as well. Yeah, but I think the bottom line, though, is that we do think that changes in how government interacts with taxpayers can have big impacts on people's attitudes towards taxation and their broader political attitudes towards reform. And we don't want to lose sight of that second part. I think a lot of this trust building is not just about tax compliance. It is about how do you build this sustained political base of support for more effective taxation.
Many thanks, Will. I want to probe a little bit the team here also. I see also linked to a question on the chat. It's an informal economy in low developing countries, implicitly with low capacity. And in the presentation, you mentioned that this the framework points towards distinctive strategies for taxing the informal sector. And especially you mentioned capturing the diversity of the informal sector and adopt this strategy more reliant on trust building. So it would be good to hear a little bit more about this, and also if there is, even within this framework, different approach for emerging economies versus low income or low developing countries, low capacity countries.
I mean, again, I've spoken to this, but let me just see, Roel or Anna, if you want to jump in here. Otherwise, I'm happy to take a first crack at this again. Okay, I'll go ahead and get the ball rolling.
Anna, did you want to go? Sorry. Well, Anna, do you want to come in?
I'll come in after. Will, please go ahead.
Okay.
Okay. So I think our approach to thinking about thanks. I think at the root of our approach to thinking about the taxation of the informal sector, and I should say here, actually, this aligns very closely with the kinds of things that Grace Wandara has described about the program in Kenya, which I found very exciting to hear. But I think the first is disaggregating what we mean by the informal sector. And when we talk about the informal sector, that incorporates potentially very large but cash-based firms that have very large profits, where a lot of money is being made, but where they're sort of intentionally operating outside the scope of the tax administration. And it incorporates very small sort of subsistence-oriented firms. I think the first insight we try to push here is just those are hugely different kind of firms. And it's not all that helpful to refer to them sort of generically as the informal sector. Because they present opportunities in revenue terms, they have very, very different needs, they have very different capacity to pay. They likewise also have very different kinds of concerns. And so understanding these different parts of the informal sector, I think what Grace had called sort of knowing your customer becomes very important. So we can have these disaggregated approaches to tackling this challenge. I think from there, one can then ask, well, what are the key concerns of these different groups, but also what are the potential benefits to seeking to bring them into the tax net? My reading of the academic literature on this is, it tends to say in aggregate, there can be benefits to firms of formalization. I think if you read that evidence closely, what you find is there are benefits to formalization for some firms, but not for others, right? Particularly for larger, more dynamic, more growth-oriented firms, actually supporting them to come into the formal tax net can carry advantages to them in terms of legal protection, access to loans, access to contracts, and so forth. For smaller, more subsistence-oriented firms, the benefits to formalization are much more unclear, and I think research sort of backs that up. And so again, that speaks to wanting to have different kinds of strategies for these different kinds of firms. I think it's against that background that we're very interested in sort of trust building strategies, because if we move away from an approach that says, how do we force firms into the tax net, but instead ask, which firms would like to come into the tax net? How do we support them to do that? And how do we increase the benefits to formalization for firms? That does two things. I mean, one is this makes it a cooperative process. There's going to be more political support for that process. And you hope that firms will come willingly into the tax net if they can benefit. But it also helps with that targeting. Because if you're sort of creating positive incentives to formalization, those firms who stand to benefit are likely to take advantage. Those firms who don't stand to benefit may lie further outside of view, but that may not be a big problem, right? That may not be our first concern anyway, given that the big revenue sits with those larger informal firms and of course with formal firms. So yeah, I think that combination of disaggregation, focusing on the more growth-oriented larger firms, and then trying to provide positive incentives to formalization by combining formalization with access to greater opportunities, I think is more likely to capture the right kinds of firms and combine revenue raising with actually creating benefit for the firms you're trying to support as they grow.
Yeah, perhaps, and to briefly just add on to that, I think an example that might be helpful here in terms of understanding, or it's an example of how things sometimes end up mostly being harassment, for example, for the smaller informal firms, and also a huge administrative burden for the tax administration, is that there have been examples and instances where there are large registration drives, which are quite effective in a way in increasing the tax base. But then following up on those registrations over time shows that many firms are unable. They do nil filings, are difficult to find. It becomes a huge administrative hassle for the tax administration as well to maintain and update their registry. Whereas at that point there is this clear trade-off from the tax administration's point of view. Where do I put most of my effort and time in terms of building a relationship with my taxpayers? So I think that what the book is also trying to say is that these differentiated strategies that Will just alluded to is one way to start building a different relationship with those taxpayers. And at the same time, there are examples where if the focus is too much on simply trying to get them into the net, that might actually be counterproductive, also from a revenue efficiency perspective.
There was also a question on online businesses. I think this all applies also to the proliferation of online businesses as well. The same themes. What are their incentives to register? And then we do a lot of work on corporate registries and beneficial ownership. But what are the incentives for the rapid onset of online businesses to get into the net?
And maybe if I can pick up on that, finally also linking this back to the discussion about the previous question, by focusing on these 4 sub-dimensions of trust, also the ones that are not directly under the control of the tax administration, like Will mentioned, we also have an angle that shows that compliance is not only an issue for the tax administration, but for broader government as a whole, as such, so that it's not only that reciprocity can also be improved through other actions in other branches of government and not solely those under the responsibility of the tax administration. So in that sense, this is a bit of a whole of government approach that we are advocating to an extent.
Thank you all, because I think we are indirectly responding also to some of later questions about, if we are assessing also the relationship between various government and powers in government. So Congress, executive, and I think the whole approach is also to look at the political setup of a country. So thank you all for that. we're really getting close to our launch today. I think I just like to give an opportunity to perhaps Grace and Irena, if you have a word for us of wisdom on this. The intention, of course, is to bring this work and approach forward, but piece of advice or something that you want to leave to all of us as a lesson learned, or any message that you want to leave. Irena?
Well, I think that a lot has been said, and we shared like a very insightful and fruitful experience from today's meeting. Commitment, the effort and the support that we need to to the tax, the method needed to, because
I don't know
what
if
we
it's me, but I'm losing Irena.
are all aiming, we are all aiming towards building a modern tax administration which relies more on voluntary compliance rather than enforcing the compliance. So I really hope that our experiences will all help to of course in time, it needs time to really be able to have the best possible.
Thank you, Irena. Let me.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Irena. Grace?
Okay. Well, I think, thank you for this discussion. When I reflect on the work that I do, because I work on the service delivery part of taxation, which is often seen as the soft side, I'm very glad that there's now some focus around the issues that the taxpayers have and some insights around how this can move forward the revenue agenda, because these are things that are rarely brought to the discussion table in terms of how the taxpayers' perceptions, their views, the trust indices can be beneficial in informing tax administrations on how to change their strategies towards enhanced revenue mobilization. So very glad to see this discussion, looking forward to the output that we will have through the engagement with the ITC, and thank you for the opportunity once again.
Thank you all. I just want to say that perhaps ending with what Will was saying, is that the idea is not new, but what is new is now to have a framework to apply and to pilot it and to roll it out. And I think we heard very positive examples in Albania and Kenya. The idea is to make this framework more ingrained in the work that we do in tax reforms, but also other reforms. And it certainly also help us, I think Paola picked it up very clearly and quickly, it's helping us to look first at the political environment and look at it not as an afterthought, but upfront, and see within those constraints how to remove or to push the boundaries for improving outcomes. And in this case would be improving revenue collection, but also fairness of the tax system. So with this, I want to thank all very much, the authors. We are obviously very proud for this report, and also the partnership with the Melinda Gates Foundation, and which has been instrumental, and I know they continue to also do research in this area, so it's it's really very positive synergies. And also want to thank a lot all the colleagues that have worked really, really hard to make today's launch a success. And so thank you all, and thank you also to the participants. Great questions and participation. And we look forward to continuing this discussion, and also we hope to have a bit more of learning lessons as we move forward to share with a wider public. And with this, wish you a very good day, and thank you very much. Bye.